Today, we dive into our second Haunted Halloween episode with Castlevania Bloodlines, or if you're in a PAL region, Castlevania The New Generation. As if there really could be any doubters at all, Konami nailed it once again with another sick 16-bit vampire slaying adventure. Bloodlines made it to most regions by 1994, and was actually first released in North America by the holiday season in 1993. This new battle against Dracula takes place at the beginning of the 20th century, where the 91 sequel Super Castlevania IV focuses attention on complete character and whip control, along with an unshakable graphical style that superbly executed realism. Our Sega Castlevania adventure is primarily more focused on a faster-paced, somewhat cartoony arcade-esque feeling and sounding experience. Bloodlines is a tough game to put your thumb on at first, since from the start you're given the choice between two characters that you haven't heard of until this point, but more importantly, they play quite a bit differently, to the point where it actually makes more sense to basically talk about this game with one character in mind at a time, to avoid consistent backtracking and contradiction. First, our attention will be on John Morris, with his playstyle being much more familiar and iconic to those already familiar with the Castlevania series. As opposed to a map of Dracula's castle, we are actually going between 6 stages scattered across Europe, making things surprisingly far apart, but that does help with having a nice variety of settings. The game makes a wise choice of starting things out with a stage and soundtrack that is immediately recognizable, and also allows you to quickly appreciate all of the audio-visual possibilities here on the Sega Genesis. The playstyle with John Morris is much more akin to the NES originals, with your whip going out straight in front of you, and your sub-weapons are actually pretty important again to get through this challenge. At some point, you'll also realize that you can whip upward diagonally if you've already jumped into the air. And important to mention, your jump is also similar to the NES games. You have a fixed jumping arc and cannot control yourself in the air. They also let you know early on as well that they're not afraid of a little blood and gore, with a cleverly placed corpse and crows early on, before taking on hordes of zombies yourself. If you haven't played Bloodlines before, it's likely that you'll be constantly fascinated with how different yet awesome everything looks and feels compared to what you're used to, and they do a nice job not wasting any time before hitting you with an incredible looking and sounding boss fight with a gigantic hellhound with an ear-piercing howl that shatters windows, resulting in dangerous falling glass. As far as first impressions go, Bloodlines really knocks it out of the park, and after the demonic beast burns to the ground, you may be shocked to realize that the level isn't even over yet. Cool and exciting mid-level bosses are something you'll grow to expect and appreciate from this game's first level all the way till its 6th and final challenge. There's no doubt that the demands of a challenging platformer haven't slowed down, and it's something that certainly gets pretty crazy by the end of it. Players that finish the original Castlevania may be surprised to see and hear something that feels straight out of its final level, because it appears to take place in the same area, and the old castle is already destroyed from the previous battles. The Genesis sound chip is bound to put a smile on your face at least a few times throughout this adventure, with its bold and memorable melodies alongside its totally unique and interesting sound effects. Often bosses have such fluid and fast movement that their attacks can be surprising, but so are their stages of decay as their health diminishes throughout many of the fights. There's just a lot going on. Stage 2 takes place at the Atlantis Shrine in Greece, and upon starting the level, you can only begin to wonder how far and wide this technical marvel of a Genesis title can go with their sounds and ideas. You'll encounter tougher Minotaur enemies that are scattered about with different weapons on Stage 2 and 3. Despite the classic control scheme, you will come across several points in Bloodlines that feel like a breath of fresh air, and something that you haven't seen much of. Not that auto-scrolling sections scream joy or anything, but it's done well with the water, and even makes sense once you fight the next mid-level boss, with this wizard using some kind of rain spell, and you have to take him out before it's too late. They don't waste any time before having you go against 2 more mid-level bosses that aren't too bad once you realize that you have to get close to the first one and keep your distance on the second. Now that the rain spell's been broken, they cleverly use the water in a descending challenge with floating platforms, which is again something you haven't really seen before, and with the addition of some Medusa heads, it's only the very beginning of the cleverness and difficulty curve. There always seems to be something extra to consider in many of the sections, with a new obstacle or problem to solve just around the corner, and there's usually something to grab your full attention to it as well. Speaking of unique and new, we encounter a different type of golem than we're used to, where you have to spend a good 20 to 30 seconds or so breaking down its midsection, while avoiding falling rocks in order to reach its weak point for a handful of good smacks with your whip is how to close things out. Stage 3 takes place at and inside the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Along with the Minotaurs, another common enemy here are these strange spear-carrying bird creatures that also sometimes remind you that this game's gore effects aren't playing around. Something that you'll continue to notice is just how many sections there are within each of these 6 levels, and to be fair, having upward of 10 or more designated sections really do help out with continuing after a death, since you aren't sent back unbelievably far. This helps balance the difficulty and frustration that comes with having to consistently repeat long sections. The next mid-level boss is a large Skeledragon, and like I've been saying, things just look and move so much differently in this game and it'll continue to surprise you. Fortunately, if you just hang out at the end of his reach and wait for the right moments, the fight isn't much of a problem at all. There's another auto-scrolling section in a falling tower with Medusa heads that you've definitely got to have your wits about you in order to not fall or get knocked off. Plus, for new-time players, you may not even realize that you can exit to the left. It really should stop scrolling when you've reached the top. But we're not done climbing yet, that's for certain. Plenty more of that to go. It's definitely cool to see the effects on the tower in the background, and as you get higher, you can also see the platforms there too, which is really cool. There are some skeleton gargoyle-like creatures that can be pretty tricky until you get the timing down of waiting for them to do their loop around you and being ready with your whip. Eventually, you do come to a large gargoyle on top of the tower, which shows off another surprising Genesis effect. It can definitely be a pretty big pain in the ass, but this is where you need to get as precise as you can with jumping up to whip in the air, which is easier said than done, because getting used to the flow can result in a ton of times of your whip barely missing, and you also have to watch out for its tail breaking into stones and flying at you, all before finishing it off as it bounces around you and the tower turning messes around with your positioning too. You really do just need to get the flow down in order to land your attacks and not get hit by one of those rocks and fall off the edge. Stage 4 takes place within a munitions factory in Germany, which starts out with a familiar feel but doesn't take long at all for the environment to be something that you've never experienced before in a Castlevania game. While the skeletons of course feel right and are a good choice with their various types, it's definitely different to be on conveyor belts and be surrounded and faced with all of this machinery in the series. Just looking at some parts reminds me of Contra a bit, honestly. However, it doesn't appear to be too different than the clock tower setting at some point, but I couldn't help but be reminded of Metal Man stage when going through this. It's classic Castlevania challenge with Medusa heads and moving platforms pretty much all over the place, but I'd like to compliment the fact that it's not annoyingly filled with screen cutoff or bottomless pits, at least not until the next section. But this concept isn't anything crazy new, as the pulley platforms are something you experience in the first Mario Bros. Game, although the control here is of course found to make it trickier, and these annoying flame ghosts can suck pretty bad if they knock you off. Here's another example of what I mean by cartoonish and arcade-like. I mean, what in the world is going on here? Like, when did Frankenstein become over 20 feet tall? Overall, the fight isn't too bad when you realize his pattern and when you should duck first getting onto a platform. Plus, his defense is actually pretty weak. After this, just some enemies to whip down and basic timing exercises with these instant kill spinning blades, and aside from the one that's spinning toward you, they're pretty simple to make it past. Things are also pretty ridiculous outside with platforms that move like a locomotive piece would and enemies standing in your way, all before reaching probably the most surprising boss of them all. Instead of another famous monster or terrifying creature, we reach a pretty goofy shape-shifting mech. This thing looks and sounds like it's from the Vector Man universe, and takes all kinds of different shapes and does a variety of weird stuff that you just have to avoid while focusing on whipping its weak point, which also has varying height throughout the fight. It's something you have to be aware of if you have any chance of getting through this. If this thing starts rolling at you, you definitely have to make a break for it and get out of the way. Stage 5, home stretch, just 2 more levels to go. This time we're in France. These last couple of challenges get pretty ridiculous, so it's easy to point out the worst of what I encountered. While the roses that change your direction of control is more interesting than it is frustrating, these damn swinging and dangerous green guys gave me the most brutal pounding and can easily be a roadblock until you properly use your sub-weapon or manage to land a couple of whips if it swings into range. But dealing with like 5 of these guys in a row, you definitely have to know what you're doing. Getting inside has you squaring up with some familiar axe-throwing knights that do take more hits than you might be used to, but they're still not that hard to deal with, especially with your whip destroying their weapon. A cool touch is that falling chandeliers can also take them out if the positioning is right. It's all pretty much an endurance test to not take much damage before going to a much more annoying room with all of these damn heads that shoot out these projectiles, and it's at a different rhythm than you might be used to, but once you manage to get that down, just have some enemies that have some strong defense but overall aren't that bad to take out, as long as you stay out of their range. And we can see another example of designs that probably should have just belonged in a different game entirely. It's a pretty strange but creative concept to use the silhouette piece as a boss fight, and the fight itself is also quite strange, where you need to attack the pillar when the faces are gone in order to get your shots in, but the tricky part is that the faces release these bouncing orbs that never go away until you manage to whip them down, and they're all moving at different angles too, so it can be quite awkward and different to get used to. But again, you have to give credit for doing something that just was not at all expected. I'd say this is an example of when a mid-level boss is actually a bit more difficult than the level's final boss. Starts out simple enough with some floating princess, and just after a few hits is when the game got me to say, wow, because of just how unexpected this transformation is. The worst part of the fight is trying to avoid the hard to see poisonous dust from its wings, but the thing is a big target and usually not very horrible to land consecutive hits on until it's all over. The final stage taking place over in England, and music has been great so far, but this is something I'll remember for a long time. They definitely planned on going out with a bang. I mean, just look at all this craziness. And we're only getting started. Here's a section that you have to master since this is your checkpoint for a while. The middle of the screen comes out of alignment, and you can see how that puts things off a few inches, so it's harder to judge where you are, and it doesn't help that stupid Medusa heads are released consistently at some of the worst times. Something that will help you right away though is somewhat ignoring the middle section as much as you can, since you can normally see where your feet are, and that's all you need in order to see where you're at to make those jumps. Plus, if you can avoid rushing into dangerous situations like jumping into the path of an enemy that knocks you backward, you'll get through it for sure. However, next section is another unusual one that I'm sure has given a lot of people a hard time now that you're upside down, and even if you weren't, the jumps and orbs that knock you backward can be pretty awful, and remember that any death on the screen has you doing the entire previous room again. Only way through is just to forge ahead and be decisive through those tight squeezes, which helps us get to the other side, and our next room isn't very bad at all. But there is a knight that tests your reactions by quickly running on the screen multiple times, and it's just simply here as one more thing to get through to finally reach one of the last checkpoints in the game. A couple of these last checkpoints pretty much look the same, so it doesn't take long at all for these colors and sound to be burned into your memory forever. I know it will be for me. So we have a pretty interesting marathon type of fight here, with Death having all of these cards rotating around. A couple of them just result in him shooting some magic from his scythe, but it's easily avoided by simply walking by at the right time. On normal mode, which is the highest difficulty you're allowed to select at first, one of the cards is actually like a free health refill, which is nice, but on expert there is no such thing, so keep that in mind. And there are 3 cards that open up rematches to the Golem, Gargoyle, and Robot boss fights, and you have to make it through all of these with a single life in order to reach the fight against Death. This whole thing reminds me quite a bit of the second to last boss in Cuphead. Not sure if anybody else felt the same way. The hope is of course that your health isn't way too low going into it. However, it is extremely nice of the game to not make you redo all of these cards if you do die on Death. If you die on any of the cards before him, you have to start this whole thing over. Death does move around in kind of a weird way, but as long as you're jumping up and just trying to land those attacks in the air and keeping your attack out, it's really not that bad to just get through it because his defense isn't very strong as well. Once you're finally through that, we reach our second to the last checkpoint in the game. First, we reach Elizabeth, the lady that's trying to resurrect Dracula, and have to go against her first Medusa form. Just like basically all of the other boss fights, there's a strict pattern to get used to, and this one involves ducking under or jumping through her blast, ducking under her fire attack, and getting the timing just right to jump over her swinging tail. As this thing does a series of awkward reaches towards you, it's the easiest time to lay down as much punishment as you can. Although you will notice that the defense is quite strong, so you definitely have to get used to pounding this first form as consistently as you can in order for this to not take forever, and if you do, it only lasts for 2 of these full attack patterns. But this next form is something I really struggled with for a minute, and the dumb thing is, I just didn't know how to go about it. There are these high-powered projectiles that are surprisingly hard and ridiculous to jump over, which is how I died a lot. But sometimes there's a much simpler answer, like ducking underneath it, even though it looks like that wouldn't work at all. But even more surprising, once you realize what you can do, the fight is completely neutered of all of its challenge, where you can just run back and forth from side to side landing your attack. It takes a while, and the whole concept is that if you take too long to get your shots in, the orbs in the middle will launch an attack when they come together. But once you know what you're actually doing, that never really should happen. After all of those boss fights, we have finally reached the last boss in the game. And it starts with Dracula doing his classic thing of reappearing over and over again before an attack. There's a distinct timing to this that's different than what you've had in the past. I had to realize myself that jumping when the light is still on the screen is just way too early. You have to see him, then jump to whip, and then you should be good enough to hit his weak point and attack at the same time. It can be annoying and stubborn, but if you focus on seeing him before jumping, the first phase will be done. The second phase kind of behaves as if it's the death fight, and you need to just focus on landing as many jump whips as you can, while also just paying attention to avoid any attacks, which can surprise you and stuff, but they're really not that awful and horribly damaging at all. You just need to focus on putting this guy away while you can. The third phase looks totally nuts, but you can see that they were feeling a similar style to the NES original with the big crazy monster final fight. The fight itself even has a few different forms. It starts off with you trying to position yourself to avoid a spread shot and then jumping in for an attack. I'm sure the fight could get a lot worse and be really tricky if you didn't bully him into the side of the screen, but that's pretty much what you're just going to try to do. Eventually, when you get his health down a bit, he changes into a red color and is now shooting a trail of fire across the floor that you need a well-timed jump in order to clear, and you follow that with whips. You can see we're already defeating its second pattern pretty easily if you just keep this up. Now, the third form is bound to probably throw you off because he's hopping around and throwing bones at this point, but you'll notice that he only throws bones in the direction that he isn't moving toward, and it's just a matter of walking underneath when you need to and hitting him as many times as you can. Before we celebrate too hard, I understand that beating the game on normal means one thing: expert mode is unlocked. I've heard and read so many times that Eric is the easier character to play through Bloodlines with, but things aren't settled with John Morris quite yet. So now we can tackle the adventure with Eric, and of course I'd like to go ahead and jump into expert mode right away. And wouldn't you know it, the classic Konami code of up up, down down, left right BA on the start menu doesn't give you any lives, but actually allows you access to expert mode right away. Obviously, bypassing normal mode and going right into expert doesn't make beating the game any easier. You still have to go through the game on the hardest difficulty setting possible. You just don't have to pointlessly use a solid hour or more on a normal setting first. Eric attacks with a spear and has a few other differences compared to John, like he can attack straight upward and diagonally while on the ground, but cannot when he's in the air, the opposite of John being able to attack upward only when he's in the air. You even have a super jump that also functions as an attack, and it actually makes some sections quite a bit easier. And I could definitely see why he makes the game a bit more simple, but I'm sure he's also a great choice for getting through this game quickly once you have good strategies down. His limitation of not being able to attack upward while in the air was pretty annoying at first, but he has surprisingly good range while on the ground, and also has the jump attack that you can use if you didn't want to wait for the boss just to get within range. Another thing to mention is that his straight up standing attack, when upgraded, can also be really great when you're in a range that actually hits the enemy twice with one poke. There are also 2 points in the adventure where Eric has to take a different route since he doesn't have a whip to cross gaps, but will instead use that super jump to find an alternate exit. Just like John, his weapon and sub-weapons can upgrade just as you would expect, and I think that about sums it up for him. So let's go ahead and cue another quick montage to summarize the expert playthrough with Eric Lacard.